Oh, it's interesting you should bring that up, actually. The book is dedicated to my mother, my brother and my sister who know the roads that I have travelled. And I guess people often think that a first novel is autobiographical, and this book is not autobiographical, although I would be lying if I denied that there was any part of me in any of the characters. For my own part, I guess the roads that I've travelled have been kind of, I don't know, varied and numerous. I had a very sort of, one might say, dissolute youth, and in my 20s I drank a lot of alcohol and took a lot of drugs, and sort of associated with a lot of people who were not dissimilar to some of the characters in The Low Road. Drug addicts such as Wilde, the doctor, for example. Petty criminals like Lee, for example, I guess. It's always interesting for me to come back to Paris, because when I was 22, I came to Paris and I was so poor I had to sleep under a bridge down at Saint-Germain, and I had all my luggage stolen, and I was sort of sleeping on the street and begging on the Boulevard Saint-Michel for my day. So I had partly my own fault. I'd spent all my money travelling on drugs and alcohol and so forth. So I sort of ended up in Paris rather down and out, one might say. But so some of those roads, I guess, that I've travelled have been less than enjoyable or legal. I do have some experience with drug use and so forth that I think that I was able to draw upon, that enabled me to write the character of Wilde in such a way that I hope it was realistic and convincing and plausible to someone who may not have had those experiences as well. The idea of yearning and longing, I think, also, and Wilde's sort of the idea that he has sort of destroyed his life. He feels that he has come to the end of his life to a certain extent, and that there's very little he can do about it, that the die has been cast. The epigram of the book is from Heraclitus, where he says a man's character is his fate. And I think that's an interesting quote, because it can be read both ways, in the sense that a man's or a person's character determines what that person will do and what that person will be in their life. But at the same time, it can be read, I think, the other way, in the sense that one's character is determined or predetermined, already written. So I guess to a large extent, The Low Road is about the ways in which these three men are able to overcome what appears to be their destiny, which is whether they're able to break out of the shackles that to an extent they have created for themselves, and be able to kind of alter their sense of destiny from something that is the trajectory seems to be, for the characters of Lee and Wilde and also of Joseph, seems to be a sort of a downward trajectory, I guess, in a noirish sense, that they're unable to break out of their cycle of criminal behaviour and despair and so forth. And I guess the question of the book is whether they are in fact able to do that. Yeah, it is true that all the characters are carrying a sense of guilt about their lives and culpability and so forth. And I guess, to a large extent, I'm more interested in the sense that this is a crime book. It's a book about the consequences of crime rather than the crime itself. And I guess what I'm interested in is the sort of, the existential problems posed by criminal behaviour to an extent, and those who, for one reason or another, have chosen a path that is perhaps considered less moral. I don't think necessarily all of us are guilty per se people. I think we've all probably done things that we regret or so forth, but I think there's a difference between a kind of recklessness and a kind of willful immorality, I suppose one might say. I was very, when I was writing the book, I was very influenced. I mean, obviously it's a very noir kind of book. It's in a tradition of noir. And I was intrigued by you know, the American sort of tradition of crime of Chandler and James Ellroy and so forth as well, but also probably in a more French tradition in the sense that I was watching a lot of the films of Jean-Pierre Melville, Le Samouraï and Le Cercle Rouge, things like this. Also Camus' L'Étranger is about the consequences of crime, and also the sort of the fact that crime can propel people into a world that's like an underworld. And The Low Road can be read as a book about three people who are journeying through an underworld to or a netherworld. There's very little sense that they have contact with normal society or polite society. There's never a sense that they're being pursued by the police, for example. So they live in their own sort of ecosystem, for want of a better word, that's completely dominated by the people they associate with and the kind of places they go to and the landscape and so forth. So yeah, it's very much a world apart from this world. I think it's hard to escape the conclusion with The Low Road that these are people who are trying to escape the crimes that they've committed, but escaping them in a way that's completely futile because they are unable to face up to the reality of what they've done, that they think that they can simply reinvent themselves without sort of coming face to face with the crimes that they've committed, I guess. So in that sense, it does have a sort of it's a powerful sort of moral story in many senses, and it could be read that there is a sort of a nod to the Judeo-Christian idea that one can't escape one's guilt. But really what I'm thinking about, I think, in The Low Road is that one can't escape one's past. The men, as they sort of journey onwards to try and escape their pasts, to a certain extent they're coming closer to it as well. And one of the sort of, I guess, the aesthetic the projects of the book is, in fact, as they journey onwards, the characters all sort of go into the past in the sense that the methods of transport become more primitive. You know, we go from a car to a train to a horse, then we're walking. So we're sort of journeying back in time, and we're journeying back in time in a sort of a physical sense, but also in perhaps, in some ways, a literary sense. Like it starts in a 20th century mode and moves back, I think, to almost a 19th century kind of novel. Particularly the final scene is something that basically I stole from Dostoevsky, from Crime and Punishment, The Horse. So yeah, so there's a sense of moving backwards all the time. The book is rather melancholy, and I think, am I a melancholy person? I think I sort of am susceptible to melancholy. Which is a sort of in some ways it's a sort of pleasurable sadness. I think melancholy, as opposed to, you know, being depressed, which of course is not pleasurable at all. But yeah, I'm much more intrigued by things that are old and sad and broken and not quite right in many respects, I think. And partly that's just an aesthetic judgment, but I think also being a writer, obviously it's a very interior kind of profession. Spend a lot of time in my head, thinking about things and so forth. And I think that kind of personality is perhaps prone to a degree of melancholy because it's perhaps a bit inward looking. I mean, one of the pleasures for me in writing and also reading is in ambiguity. Most of my books are quite ambiguous in the sense of, or I try to attain a sort of ambiguity in the sense of whether things are really true or whether they're happening or what really happens to the characters at the end. Maybe not so much with Low Road, but yeah, I guess, so those kind of qualities I think are more apparent in the darkness than the light. It would be a mistake to say that writing sort of saved me from you know, drinking too much or taking too many drugs or anything, although I think it was connected to it in the sense that I realised I was unable to produce anything of any great quality or merit if I was stoned, basically. So that was a big sort of driving force for me trying to lead a more respectable life, we might say. So yeah, and it's certainly, I find it incredibly satisfying as a career, you know, to be able to produce things that people read and enjoy, and you know, travel the world and talk to people who, you know, read it 10,000 miles away. It's incredibly gratifying, yeah.